Amanda Upton is not in the room at the moment. She's the founder and proprietor of this lovely place, Putney Move, so I want to thank her for hosting us. Maria Hernandez is our most capable and wonderful videographer.
Dominguez.
Can you hear me? No?
Maria Dominguez.
Dominguez. Maria Dominguez, excuse me, is our wonderful videographer. And so, thank you, Maria, again for that. So, why don't we start with a short meditation? We'll have 3 different meditations during the next little bit. And this is fairly informal, so let's just, the most important thing is to sit with a straight back. Keep your eyes open or closed as you will. Be symmetrical so that your hands are someplace to just balanced in your lap or on your side. And again, let's just breathe very naturally and observe the breath. Observe it come in. And again, there are many ways to meditate. This is a very simple, age-honored one. We exhale and we'll count to number 1. Inhale. 2. 3. So we're trying to bring ourselves to this place in time, to these very seats, to this very moment, to this very breath. We're very busy people. We have a lot to do, a lot of worries and stress. Count at your own pace. Breathe naturally. 5. We talk about dropping into the body. We live so much in our heads, just literally drop into these seats here. Feel the weight fall from our head down into our bodies. 6. As our mind wanders, just bring it back to our breath. No need to critique it. We're not bad meditators. Just come back to our breath and we start on number 1 or holding it. So, again, welcome everybody. Welcome back from the sitting here. Just out of curiosity, if you could kindly, who was here last week, a couple weeks ago? Kevin, nice to see you again. So what I'd like to do to start is just fill folks in a little bit without being overly repetitious for you folks. As you probably figured out, my name is Tom Redden. Again, I'm really honored to be here, and I welcome each and every one of you. And my brief bio is that I am a professor at Southern Vermont College. I'm a political scientist. I teach politics as well as history there and other things. In terms of the outfit here, I should lay claim to the fact that I am a really, really terrible dresser. I mean, just a really, really bad dresser. Hey, Ron, come on in. Please have a seat. That chair was waiting just for you, so it has your name on it. Thanks, Nancy. Good evening, Ron. Good to see you. So, as I said, I teach at Southern Vermont College, which is over in Bennington. I've been there for about almost 20 years. I was at Marble College for 7 years before that. For me, I've had literally the best jobs in the whole wide world, being a professor and being a teacher. And in terms of the outfit I'm wearing, as I said, I really am a notoriously boring dresser. And anything beyond blue or beige, I think, is just too radical. And my beloved wife, whose intelligence supersedes me on so many levels, at such levels that, I listen to everything she says, and especially true when it comes to my attire. So when she says I look good in black, I believe her, and so I stay with the black. So these are robes. I'm a novice ordained priest in the Zen Peacemaker Order. For those of you who are familiar with Buddhism or Japanese Buddhism, this is predominantly a Soto Zen sect. And again, for folks who are extremely familiar, there's another school called Rinzai, and this tradition also falls somewhat in that lineage. And I've been part of that tradition for more than 35 years, and lived abroad a few years before that. So anyways, this endeavor, these sets of 4 talks that I'm giving represent a confluence of 2 central and important parts of my life. One has to do with teaching and about politics in particular, and 2 is a Buddhist practice and everything that entails. And for those of you who follow this a little bit, over the last 40 or 50 years in the United States and in the West, there's been a development of what's called engaged Buddhism. And these are folks like the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh and people like that, Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma, and they write and are activists. They're Buddhists, and they apply Buddhist principles and practices to the realm of politics. And there are lots of wonderful American Buddhist teachers and practitioners who have embraced this. It's a very strong tradition in Asia, although historically Asia has, from a political point of view, has not been active as we usually define politics. All of which is to say that this is a very interesting time in terms of world history. Albert Einstein, among others, have identified Buddhism as one of the great developments in human history. And the fact that some of you are familiar with Gary Snyder, the poet, and he's been a practicing Buddhist and writer for a long time, and he captures a lot of what a lot of people in this field and in this practice believe and would support. And this quote is something to the effect that the mercy of the West is social justice, or I think he calls the mercy of the West is revolution. And what he means by that is social justice, meaning equal rights, civil rights, democratic practices, a lot of the practices that we very much believe in throughout the Western world. And he says the mercy of the East is two parts. He says the mercy of the East is the void or emptiness. And what he's talking about there is the contemplative tradition. And so we have on one hand this politics, the domain of social and political power and the distribution of resources, and on the other hand we have a very individual pursuit and possibly a collective pursuit of who we are as human beings and who are we in fact and what is this life about. And so again, my endeavor here is to try to make sense, very much as a political scientist, as well as a practicing Buddhist, what might a politics of compassion, what might a politics of Buddhism or Buddhist politics actually look like? How do we bring compassion, loving kindness, loving your neighbor into a domain that is just often a brutal and savage and relentlessly violent competition? And the question is, how do we merge those two? And it's a huge question that I'm slowly trying to really sort of navigate my way through. And so one of the reasons I'm giving these talks in a very simple matter is that it helps me to figure out what the heck I think about this, and it forces me to ask a lot of questions and dig into some of these issues. And in terms of the disciplines that I'm bringing to the table, in addition to political science, which really is not sort of formally brought in terms of the reading and so forth, but it, number one, has to do with Buddhist studies, the contemplative world, if you will, number one. The second is psychology, and the third is neuroscience. And what's happened in the last 30, 40 years in terms of what we understand about the brain is just phenomenal. And what's very, very interesting is that what Buddhism has argued for 2,500 years, things about like the self. What is the self? For those of you familiar with this, we talk about the notion of emptiness, the idea of no self. And what neuroscientists have come to is the fact that scientifically that's true, is that if you look at the physical nature of the body and the brain, in fact, there is no center. There is no substantial entity that you can call the self. And I'll just tell you before I forget is that this is anyway, so these are a few of the books that these are the main books I've been using, like many others, recently to investigate this. And this is the self-illusion, one neuroscientist. This other one is very, very interesting, the Buddhist brain. You know, there's a bunch of books out called The Conservative Brain and Bush's Brain. I'm sure there'll be one out soon about Trump's brain. And this is really interesting. And the argument's very simple. The neuroscience supports what the Buddha came to 2,500 years ago. The other one here is by a Buddhist scholar, Andrew Olensky, about untangling the self. And it's a very, very, for me, a very deep and very profound book. So if you're interested just in references, I find those have been really, really helpful for me to begin to understand this. And the other term that I've come to in the last couple of weeks and really thinking more deeply about this is this notion of deep politics. In addition to a Buddhist politics, a politics of compassion, the politics of loving your neighbor. If we think in terms of deep politics, and that functions on two levels, is that politics historically is about self-interest. What is your interest? If you're a businessman, my interest is lower taxes. If I'm looking in education, I'm interested in more money to go to public schools, right? In terms of national interest in foreign policy, our interest is to have access to cheap and available oil from the Middle East. Our interest is to have alliances in Europe so that if the Russians, formerly the Soviet Union, if they got too ambitious, we would have a mutual defense. Historically, we have this notion that politics is about what we want. If you're a Democrat, you have your interest. If you're a Republican, you have your interest. They're fundamentally selfish. This is the definition of politics from Thucydides' book and whatever the book is that came out of China a million years ago. But it's all about what I want. And the argument that I am developing is to say that historically that has been okay until today. That with climate change, global warming, the globalization, the interconnectivity of the world, is that narrow self-interest is not going to fly. And that unless there is what the Dalai Lama calls mutual interest on all levels, we're really in trouble. And so my, if you will, working hypothesis here is that Buddhism as a vehicle to explore the self, as well as exploring the world around us, is a marriage of the two directions we need to go. We need to look out and we need to look in at the same time. And when we do that, it means that we're not alone, we can't pretend to be alone, and we're not going to survive, and we're surely not going to thrive if we pretend to be alone. And so, you know, I gave this talk a little while ago, and a wonderful friend, Tim Little, taught at Marble College for 100 years. He said, you just overthrew the last 3,000 years of political science by suggesting that we can do anything other than be selfish in politics. And here's a supposition that, in fact, it's not a question of if we can, it's the fact that in many ways I think we don't have any choice, but we will not have any choice. So, from a Buddhist perspective, in looking at a question like this, and let's begin with the sort of internal investigation here. When we look at ourselves, there are three questions that traditionally a Buddhist would ask. Number one, what is the motivation? What is the intention in what I'm doing? And in terms of Buddhist morality, intentionality is at the heart of it. What is my motive when I act in this way? And if your motive is basically loving kindness, unselfishness, then what you're going to do is probably going to be okay. So number one is motivation. Number two is the question of the means. It's interesting that Buddha had his opinion about wealth. He said, wealth is fine. Is it better to be rich or poor? Well, if you're rich, your children are not hungry. That's a good thing. And he says, the question is, how do you get your money? Is it moral? Fine. And the second question is, how do you spend it? So in the same light, and as long as you're spending it well in a loving and a generous way, then better to have more money than to be without. So motivation, intention is the first, the means in which we investigate the second, and the third in terms of ourselves, in terms of our judgments, and the third, what are the consequences? You know, what is our most motivation when we look at ourselves, when we look at politics? Number two, again, I'm repeating myself, how are we going to carry it out? And again, in Buddhism, means and ends are the same. You know, to do something unethical, to get an ethical end, is a huge compromise. And what we do is what we are, and who we are. So we moral here to get to a moral place. Machiavelli's argument that end justifies the means is simply not okay. And then finally is the issue of consequences. And this is really, really important at this time in history in this country when language and ideology, and today I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on ideology, is the fact that our ideas, our values often come before the impact on human beings. If we look at this budget, if you look at different Obamacare and Trumpcare and all these other as I said, the budget that's come out of the House, the impact on human beings is so profound, so deep, so broad, so vast, that we have to look very, very deeply at the consequences or the potential consequences for these. Okay. So the second piece here, in addition to this internal investigation, is really to look outside to the world. And what that means today is to look at Trump's presidency and the forces beyond Trump. And it's really important, I think, to understand that Donald Trump is a symptom. He's an entity unto himself, and yet he's a symptom of much, much larger forces in the world. We see all this stuff going on, all the things going on worldwide, from Brexit to the refugee crisis and all sorts of other issues. This is not an isolated event, and we need to look at more systemic levels. And just a couple things that come to mind. I'm not going to run with this too much at all tonight. I'll look at this a little bit later in the next couple talks. But number one, it has to do with basically the world political economy, the so-called neoliberal vision of private enterprises running wild, social services being cut back. You know, the whole inequality, the move toward inequality is not a mistake. When we look at this from a systems perspective, one of the guiding principles of systems theory is that systems produce what they're intended to produce. And if it's your body, it's your mind, if it's the economic system, if it's the religious system, whatever it may be, what we're experiencing in terms of global inequality is due to the structure that exists. It's producing what it's intended to be producing. We should not fool ourselves. We have the question of endless consumption. You know, we have an economic model. It's all based on purchasing, purchasing, purchasing. And some of you have read this. The question is, you know, when the world becomes much, much more middle class, and the middle class is growing every day monumentally, is that we will require basically 4 Earths. I mean, we're looking at 100 years, but we need 4 Earths to provide a middle class lifestyle for everybody. Lifestyle is sort of the Western lifestyle, which is to say that endless consumption is not going to fly in the long run. This notion of individualism, it's all about me, is something I think we look deeply at. And this whole sort of gravitation toward tribalism. It's all about me and my group, my blood, my race, or my politics, my party, my ideology. And again, it's just feeding a very, very dangerous dynamic, I think. And so the question is, in light of these sort of global developments, how do we fit this politics of compassion into it? And that's the question we're trying to investigate. Okay. Now, just quickly in terms of the next 2 talks that's going to follow here, the next talk in a week from now is going to be on the specifics of a Buddhist model. And what that means is that from a domestic policy point of view, what does a Buddhist politics look like in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of the tax system? And what does it look like in terms of foreign policy? Okay? And I will tell you that this is a domain that Buddhist writers avoid like the plague. You know, I've read a lot of the leading Buddhist teachers in the US and elsewhere who have written about responding to Donald Trump's election. And to a person they say, we should not support a party, we should not take really, really sort of explicit positions on certain things. Global warming, yes. Poverty, yes. But to get into the political fray, they're really staying apart. And so this is a very interesting terrain to delve into. And finally, so next week, that's what I'm going to focus on. And a lot of this, well, we'll just see, a lot of this will be very tentative on my part. Because the question is, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, how do we approach taxes? And one of the interesting things I will say in anticipation is that the Buddha wrote, I mean, what we have as so-called the Buddhist writings, he said a lot about politics, a phenomenal amount, much more than one would imagine. He talked about marriage, he talked about business, he talked about the kings, very, very interesting. So there's actually a lot more, there's a lot that supposedly Buddha said, I'll surely draw from that. Okay, so for those of you so that's the third one. So the fourth talk is going to talk about sort of political action. you know, the term I used in the write-up was the idea of a bodhisattva army. You know, the bodhisattva is that archetypal Buddhist figure who literally dedicates his or her life to alleviating the sufferings of others. The Buddhists, I'll get into the whole bodhisattva archetype, is very, very interesting. In Christianity, it's sort of like the saint-like figure. It's the saint who's given his or her life, you know, to the service of others. That's the bodhisattva. And so this, you know, the idea of how do we create a bodhisattva army, you know, in which people dedicating their lives to the service of others. And of course, we know lots of people. There are bodhisattvas filling this room here, because I know a bunch of you all, that you've dedicated your lives to serving other people. I know that. That is a fact. And so the question is how to sort of make this one of the really great aspirations of our culture. You know, how do we create a culture that supports compassion as opposed to competition and winning at all costs and getting ahead? Okay. Very quickly, in terms of last couple of weeks ago, the first talk, I talked about the self, the notion in Buddhism that there really is no substantial entity that is ourselves. It's in that in many ways life is this momentary sort of fleeting process of perception and reaction and consciousness and making sense of it all. And the idea that there is no self, the real issue is why do we cling to ourselves? And ourselves are often defined in terms of our opinions, our attitudes, our belief systems, our values, and how we get angry. Oh my God, I've waited 10 minutes on the telephone. What's the matter with these people, right? What's the matter? You cut me off. Do you see that? Are you kidding me? I mean, the number of things we are attached to that are so mundane, and the amount of frustration that we create for ourselves is almost endless. And so Buddhism is arguing is that we hold on to stuff so tightly. And it's okay to have opinions and all the rest, but chill out. Literally, let go a little bit. You know, loosen the grip. And, you know, life will be a little bit easier. And you'll actually be a nicer person to others, and everybody will be better. Okay. Now, last class, part of the focus was on zazen, which is sitting meditation and mindfulness. And when I got home, I realized that we had talked around those two things. I mean, we did the zazen sitting formal meditation practice for a bit, but I sort of talked around mindfulness. So I want to start off by spending a little bit of time on mindfulness and meditation, okay, from a Buddhist perspective. And I know that a bunch of you have short, medium, long-term practices. So, and I recognize that, and so whatever I say, you know, take it or leave it. A lot of you have a huge amount of experience. And my take here is obviously just my take on this. There's lots of ways to meditate. There are lots of ways to practice mindfulness. And the other thing I should say, which is a caveat that I should have said at the very beginning, is that, you know, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything here or at any time. I'm really not. If you agree with me or not, it's all good. I would swear, but I'm not going to swear. I realize that. And the fact is that for me, I appreciate the opportunity to for me to sort of offer this for folks. Anything that's helpful, this is like AA meeting, go to the meeting. If it's helpful, take it away, otherwise forget about it, you know. So whatever's helpful is good, all right? So please, I'm not selling any product here, all right? If you don't buy it, don't worry about it. And if you do, I hope it's helpful. And so mindfulness, just a couple of things I find very interesting, is that, and actually let me read this, this is worth this. I wrote this is the Dhammapada, one of the classic Buddhist texts. And I just wanted to read this because this really gets to the heart of the matter very simply. Ron, I really want to be able to see you, so you know. So anyways, this is one of the classic Buddhist texts, and this is literally the first page. It says, all experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows as a wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows, like a never-departing shadow. And then the classic, with those of you who follow some of this in the literature, you've read this many, many times. And it's, hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hatred, many say by love, alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. Hatred is never going to be defeated by hatred, but only by love. And in many ways, this is at the heart of what this kind of politics is all about. Now, in terms of mindfulness, which has become very popular in many domains, and again, a lot of you know this, but for those of you who don't, it might be of interest to you. And let me say that my purpose here is twofold. Number one is to help folks in their own practice of meditation, of sitting, folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about Buddhism. So there's that whole piece of it. It's your, in any ways that sitting for 5 minutes together or 10 minutes can help you, that would be lovely. Number two is that some of you are probably very interested in Buddhism, so I want to talk about that. And the third has to do with this political question. So it's an interesting sort of combination of all of them. In terms of the mindfulness piece, which goes hand in hand with meditation, many of you know this story, but I'll share it just the same for those of you who might not, is that, Buddhism historically developed in Asia 2,500 years ago, roughly 150 years ago. A bunch of British were going to India as part of the colonial experience there. Anyways, Buddhism became almost discovered in the West, and a lot of the ancient writings were discovered as a result of that, and these great pillars that King Emperor Asoka had developed. And anyways, but Buddhism has been around really seriously for probably about 40 or 50 years in the West, including the United States. And this young guy by the name of John Kabat-Zinn got a PhD from MIT in 1971 in molecular biology. Obviously, very bright guy. And he was very interested in Buddhism. And he had gone to a number of teachers. Make a long story short, he decided to combine some of Buddhist meditation with his work as a scientist. And based at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in Worcester, they began to see what meditation did on cancer patients, and if it helped in the recovery, sort of mind component, if you will, of the physical recovery. And I should probably say the mind-body piece, but the point is that, well, geez, how can relaxation and concentration, make a long story short, it began this phenomenal research, body of research that has proven, has beyond any doubt that mindfulness meditation, basically following your breath, and I'll provide a few more details in a second, but basically it helps people regardless of what's going on in their lives. People who are sick, people who are recovering from cancer, people who are in prison, people who are in education, people who are in business, you name it. To develop mindfulness in our lives is good for our health. Mental and physical health, it's as simple as saying, does physical exercise help? And the answer is, yup, it does. If you take someone exercise 4, 5, 6 times a day, a week, guess what? You're going to be a little healthier than if you never ever exercise. And this is the same thing, this sort of exercise of the mind. The mindfulness has three, I mean, his definition is very concise. And he defines, this is John Kabat-Zinn, and I did his, maybe some of you know the mindfulness-based stress reduction course. It's 8-10 weeks, something like that. It's very, I think it's very well done, all sort of research-based, evidence-based. It's not all over the world. Anyways, he defines mindfulness as moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. Moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. So if we break that down, what it means is that we're paying attention right now, right here, fully aware, without judgment. And it's, you know, as I think about it, if I could, you know, sort of physically do it, it's like, oh. It's like, you know, oh. This, you know, when you're surprised by something, oh, wow. Oh, my beloved came back from Italy, and she said, sweetheart, I have a present. First I said, a present? I'm shocked. I mean, I'm not kidding. Why would? And anyways, then she gave me a little piece of chocolate. I went, oh, chocolate. You know, it's like, I have no, you know, it's lovely, you know, but mindfulness is like, it's that sort of surprise, you know. But the idea of trying to bring that to literally everything in our life is that it's paying attention right here without judgment. And of course, we live in a culture where we're critiquing everything, especially if one goes on in education. What you learn how to do is critique. And you learn models of critique, and then you learn theories, and then you sort of live your life by these theories. And if you don't have education, we have opinions about everything. So this is a radical way to live, because what happens, you get out of your head, and you're embodied. The experience is literally embodied. Oh, hi. Hi. So mindfulness is that moment-to-moment presence. And to be light, you know, in our head as well as on our feet. The meditation, one way to look at it, is to say, okay, to be able to do that, to have that sort of freshness, requires some practice. Because we just don't do it. We're into our rhythms and our assumptions and our predispositions and our habits and our opinions and prejudices and biases. And yeah. Our mind is not naturally sort of to be free in that way. And what happens is that the meditation it's exercising the muscles of our mind to be present. And here's one of the things that's important about the meditation, is that one reason that we sit still, and this is really, again, there's different types of meditation. We're going to do a little walking meditation in a while when you need a break. But the idea of sitting still, completely still, following the breath, what it does, it isolates the mind. Here it is. Oh God. I do the stove on. Oh my God. Oh shit, I have to make that phone call. It's going to be awful. It's going to be sure I can't do what she said. She's always like that. The mind, you know, to be able to keep it here, it takes practice. It takes practice. And the reason why we try to stay still is that, you know, if I'm moving around, my energy is going to the movement, but if I'm absolutely still, I can't hide from the mind. It's right there. And so again, we use the vehicle, the tool of the breath. We all have the breath. It's right there. You don't have to buy anything. Here it is. 1, 2. And again, the counting is extra, but it's a nice tag. It's a hook. 3, 4. And after a while, people stop counting. If you get concentration improves, it's better. So, the mindfulness is the practice of sort of living out the meditation in our daily life. And the thing is about it is that we can practice mindfulness regardless of what we're doing. We're going to stand up in a few minutes, and I'm going to ask you to be mindful of our legs and our back and what's in front of you and the people. If you're driving the car, you're 10 minutes. Just drive. Follow your breath. But again, so the idea is that we have to appreciate being mindful takes practice. Meditation is the exercise to do to help that. And so the relationship between mindfulness and meditation is very, very clear. Okay. So, what I'd like to do is sit for a few minutes, okay? I want to recognize, it's 8 o'clock. Most of you have worked probably a long day. You had dinner a couple hours ago. Some of you, if you're at home, you were on your way upstairs. So I understand that this is a bit of a stretch for folks. So we will do our best collectively to be mindful of what's going on here. And let me again review from last time what we call zazen. Zen Buddhism is the so-called sitting school of Buddhism. In Sanskrit, it's called dhyana. Out of India and China, it's chan. And then when it was brought to Japan, it became Zen. And it means the sitting school. So sitting as in sitting meditation. And so let me give you the basic guidelines. Again, some of you may have known this for many decades at this point, so I don't mean to insult anyone. But for folks for whom this might be new or a refresher, let me walk through it. And again, the important thing is that we always need to be comfortable. And the pillow is here to make sure that my back isn't breaking during this whole time. So be kind to yourself when it comes to sitting. If you need to sit in the chair, sit in the chair. There's no, this isn't a contest of who can sit the most full lotus position for how long. This is not what this is about. This is really, the simple guideline, the body should be as still as possible so we can really pay attention to the mind. Okay? So if you want to sit against the wall or something like that, please do so. So the idea is that our backs are straight, we're not rigid about it, but we're upright. People talk about, a string going to the top of our head straight above us. Our eyes are cast down a little bit. We're about 20 or 30 degrees, maybe 45 degrees in front of us on the ground. So right about here, if you're looking at the ground. And so ideally, our mouths are closed, our tongue basically compressed. You can put it against your top of the roof of your mouth, put it lightly against the back of your teeth. But the idea is that you don't want to be swallowing a lot. So you basically compress your mouth. Again, the usual directions is to keep your eyes open. If you want to close them, that's fine. But we're looking down, so our back is straight, our mouths are closed, our heads are tilted down just a little bit. Eyes open or closed. If they're open, you want it to be soft, so you're not staring at a place. But basically soft, they become a little bit fuzzy. It's perfectly fine. And the idea is that we just breathe naturally. I should say in terms of the hand position, again, I know this is repetitious for some folks, is that, again, you read different things in different books, but most of them ensure the practice that we do in my tradition, right hand on the bottom, left hand on top, and your thumbs touch ever so lightly together. They create the so-called cosmic mudra. If you look straight down, when I look straight down, they're literally covering up my middle finger on my left hand. So so they should meet. And so when we're meditating, we're paying attention to our back, should be straight. We're following our breath, and we're actually also sort of aware of our thumb tips, that they sit, that they touch ever so gently together. So this is a way to pay attention throughout. So again, and then we're inhaling. We'll do this for about 5 minutes, okay, which may seem really quick or really long depending on how you're feeling, and I'll talk a little bit here and guide us a little bit. So we're inhaling, exhaling, counting 1. We're going to go to 10 and then back to 1. So this is a practice. We inhale, we exhale, we count 1, inhale, exhale 2, go up to 10, back to 1. At any point, if you lose count, which we all will pretty quickly, simply begin at 1 again, and there's no judgment whatsoever. We're all beautiful, wonderful meditators. One. 2. 3. 4. Go at your own pace. 5. So really try to bring your energy to the breath. We're breathing naturally, but also we're really trying to focus. 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. So let's make this next breath as focused as we can. 4. And the next one. 5. Try to bring your breath down to your stomach if you can. So as you inhale, your stomach goes out. You exhale, your stomach comes in. Helps us get out of our head. This is not the time to figure out our lives. do that later. So as our mind wanders, let's come back to the number one. I'll ring the bell in just a moment, but let's just pay attention to where we are mentally, physically, emotionally. How are we feeling? Are we truly present right here? Can we be? So what I'd like to do now is what we call walking meditation. And so let me briefly describe and then I'll demonstrate that if I could. And so we're going to stand up. Folks who are willing and able. And we're going to form a line and we're going to walk around the room, okay? And the walking meditation has a number of purposes. In the monasteries and in the centers, it's usually done in combination with sitting meditation. So you sit for anywhere from 25, 30, 40, however many minutes. And then they ring the bell, and then there's walking meditation from 5 to 10 minutes. And the idea is literally to sort of stretch your legs, to get exercise and all of that. The other thing is that this is much more like our lives, where we're walking around doing stuff, okay? And so this is a perfect exercise, if you will, in mindfulness, that we're really paying attention to what we're doing. So what we'll do is that we'll stand up in just a moment, and we'll stand. I'll show you, again, this is more formal Zen, we'll take a bow, we'll put our hands in a particular position. And then where our hands, I'm going to ask folks to put your left hand here, and some people put their thumb on the inside, others on the outside, and then your right hand is on top of it, okay, over the Sukhahara, the lower belly button, supposedly the sort of spiritual energy centers of our body. And so we're going to walk, and we're beginning by walking very, very slowly, slow motion. And then after that, we'll do it, I'll clap, and then we'll walk at a regular pace, okay? And the idea is that we're going to, in the beginning, we'll follow our breath somewhat formally, and then after that, we'll just be paying attention, okay? We won't follow the breath as much. And so, in terms of those of you who are either have a meditation practice, want to develop one, want to have a more diverse one, the sitting meditation's great strength from my experience, is the fact that we're able to focus on the mind so succinctly, so specifically. The walking meditation is lovely for people who are just a little antsier, who are a little more high energy, and some people just find it intolerable to sit for more than a couple of minutes. They just do, and that's fine. The walking meditation can be just a beautiful, beautiful practice, discipline, if you will, for you. And the combination can be wonderful as well. Okay? So, as we're standing up, I want to suggest that we really pay attention to the fact that I'm standing up. Okay, and everything that goes with that, from stretching our legs. So let's just stand up in our seats, if you will, our place here. And again, go slow. Some of you have been sitting. And just for information, usually in the the more formal centers, we usually hold our hands like this, and someone will clap, and then we begin to form a line. And again, we put your hands here. And so what I'm going to suggest we do is that we're going to walk very slowly, and if I can have, we'll just navigate around the chairs and so forth. If we could just if I could pull you along to make it so that we can walk around the perimeter. And so, I think what we'll do is that if you could file after me, Nancy, if you come this way, and then if you can. Sure, and I guess if, I'm going to walk down here, okay? And so, what we basically want to do, if we can walk in a single file, and however you do it, just do it in a somewhat systematic fashion. But basically, this is what we're going to do, is that our hands are here. In the slow walking meditation, we coordinate our breath. So we inhale. I have a poor balance, so please, I may tip, don't worry about it, I won't fall over or anything. But so it's inhale, lift, exhale, foot down. And again, basically take a small step. Some people do it, heel to toe. Other people do it a little bit differently. But basically, it's coordinated with the breath. So it's inhale, exhale. Again, my balance isn't great. Inhale, and we're walking slow motion. Exhale. So it's. And I guess, so why don't, sure, this is fine, that's good. So what we'll do is, let's just do this, so sort of follow, and we'll make a line, and we'll follow, eventually we'll follow each other around the perimeter, okay? So just walk, inhale, exhale. And so again, what we're doing is that we're paying attention, we're lifting our foot. Feel your foot, your heel come down on the floor. Feel you take that full step.
Is each step how to inhale and exhale?
Yeah, so inhale is you pick it up, exhale, put it down. So inhale, lift, exhale, down. Inhale, up, exhale, down. And again, don't worry so much about the form if it's a little bit one way or the other. It's really about trying to simply pay attention openly to the walking, be aware of the body, be aware of the breath. No need to judge yourselves. Okay, and so at that point, you would have a clap, and everyone would bow, and then we're just going to walk at a regular pace. And what you try to do is keep up a distance of, a few feet of the person in front of you. So don't let a big gap. You close the gap between you and the person in front of you. So it'll be a slow start here, but so again, so we're going to walk at a regular pace now, literally as if we're walking down the hall, okay? We'll fall into line. Beautiful. So just breathe naturally, there's not so much of a coordination here. And again, the idea is to just walk. You don't have to judge what we're doing. You don't have to compare. Pay attention to your body, where your mind is. Try not to be distracted. Try not to look around. This is a practice. So we'll do this half circle and then we can all return to our seats. And again, let's pay attention. Let's be mindful of sitting down. Pay attention to our body and where we are. So just feel free to go to your seats and make yourself comfortable again. Any questions or comments about any of that? Yeah, please.
Is the gaze during the walking about the same, kind of 45 degrees?
Yeah, or just, right, just in front of you, a couple feet.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And sometimes, practically sometimes when we do that, at a center or a monastery or something, we literally may go outside for a walk, especially if you're on a retreat or something, just to get some fresh air and stuff. So, sometimes pragmatically you have to sort of look around. But basically, if it's in a hall like this, you're just trying to, is to really keep the focus here just so that we're really sort of paying attention to where our mind is. But yeah. Anybody have any other questions about the sitting meditation, the walking? Okay, so we're going to switch focus a little bit to politics. And when I teach about history of politics, or whatever the topic is, but it's often about contemporary issues, I'm fully aware that I have conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats in my classes. And so at all times, I do my best to absolutely respect everybody's point of view. And even though we are in Vermont and we're in Putney, Vermont, I will make no assumptions about people's politics. And one of the dilemmas I'm having with this whole enterprise is, you know, in Buddhism there's the notion of right speech. And there are basically three criteria for right speech. And the idea is that what is proper speech, what is healthy speech, what is wholesome speech, what is loving kindness speech. And number one is it true? Number two is it timely? You know, is this factually true? Is it the time to say it? Even if it's true, it may not be the time to say it. And the third is it appropriate in terms of, is this helpful? And often this is referred to in terms of, is it going to be divisive or is it going to help unify people? And one of the difficulties about discussing any contemporary politics is to make a moral assessment about an issue that some people will find offensive because they happen to agree with it, right? You know, I have prejudice that if 20 million people, 23 million Americans lose health insurance, that's a bad thing. And from a Buddhist perspective, that's pretty straightforward because Buddhism is about trying to alleviate suffering in the world, right? We're trying to alleviate suffering in the world in all of its forms. 23 million people, no health insurance, the amount of human suffering as a result of that is devastatingly huge. I mean, the amount of anxiety and physical pain and the number of people who will die unnecessarily, it's just a monstrous amount of suffering. I find that, from a Buddhist perspective, ethical perspective, unacceptable. That's my prejudice. So, and I'm not actually going to get into those issues today. I'm going to get into a couple of other issues. And I'm going to talk, I mean, Donald Trump is difficult for me because there is so much, in my opinion, and I'm going to keep this is my opinion, right? I'm not trying to, you don't agree, that's okay. Really, I don't care. But in my opinion, there's so much happening that's causing human suffering here and abroad that, you know, just we need to speak the truth about it. Number two, is this timely? Yes, because it's happening. Is it going to bring division? And is it appropriate? I think it's appropriate. Will it turn some people off? Maybe. And I'm not sure what to do about that. They're real diehard people who think that everything he does is great. Then that's difficult, but I'll have to let go of that. And so, but when I talk about things, this is about policies and the impact. It's not about him as a human being. That's another critique. I'm not interested in that here for sure. And the other thing is the fact that Donald Trump is part of a much larger phenomenon, politically, globally, and even if he represents one end of that phenomenon, or that phenomena, there's a lot going on without it, that's for sure. In the first talk, I talked about the self. And if we are going to have compassionate politics, it seems to me that we all need to be investigating who the heck we are. And one of the things that's really interesting from a Buddhist perspective, and this is what the neuroscientists are discovering, they talk about the fact that we're many selves, and that at different times of the day, and maybe within a minute, we're different people. Sometimes we're really generous and kind, and other times we're like nasty and mean just because we're so darn mad at something. And other times we're very thoughtful, and other times we're very forgetful, and sometimes we're really aggressive, and other times we're just incredibly sweet and fairly passive. We have many, many selves. And one of the interesting things about Buddhism, as well as neuroscience, is that they talk about the different selves. And from a neuroscientist's point of view, depending on the stimuli that comes in, certain neural bundles of neurons are going to fire. if someone insults me, may trigger a certain reaction, which is going to fire certain neurons, which is going to have the neurotransmitters sort of spew forth, and that's going to cause a certain reaction in me, and so my aggressive side is going to come out. But 5 minutes later, that person apologizes, and another bunch of responses will take place, and my very forgiving and understanding self sort of comes out because a different part of the brain has been stimulated based on the stimuli that came in. And then, something fell on my back, and all of a sudden there's a whole other phenomenon, and now I have another self coming forward. And one of the things I've been thinking about, especially, and I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, and I try to be compassionate and understanding. And if you folks are, some folks are, that's lovely, really. And yet the question is, for me, is this notion of, am I Donald Trump? Thich Nhat Hanh is this great Vietnamese Buddhist monk, activist, poet, writer. He has this beautiful poem called something like "Call Me by My True Name." And basically what he says is, and he was a guy who was in Vietnam during the war, and then he was helping Vietnam. Some of us, probably all of us remember this, most of us. You remember when the Vietnamese boat people, after the war, they were up and about in off the coast of Thailand and so forth, and the Thai pirates were abusing those folks, and a lot of women were raped, and it was just an awful situation. And so here is Thich Nhat Hanh, this Vietnamese Buddhist monk, going out to try to save some of these people in these boats. And he says, and he's trying to be compassionate, and he says, I'm the fisherman who has the boat, who grew up, in a long line of fishermen. And I'm the young girl who was cast aside as a child and fled her home and was raped by the Thai pirate in the boat in the middle of the ocean. And she fell and drowned as a result of her trauma. And then he goes, and I'm the Thai pirate who raped that small girl because I grew up in a family where my father used to violate my mother and my sisters, and I had to sit there and watch. And in Buddhism, there's this notion that when we really reach a level of emptiness, of openness, of loving kindness, there really is no separation between those and the people around us. It's like parents and child. We just, a mother and the young babies, that there's literally no separation between the two. It's as if you are one person. And in many ways, that's what we're trying to achieve in our loving kindness in this world, it seems to me. And this notion of I am Donald Trump is, I've been working on that. And part of it, and what's helped me come to this in Buddhism is there's this notion of what's called the 6 realms. And the idea is that, for those who believe in karma and you believe in rebirth, the question is, where are you going to be reborn in Buddhism? There's sort of 6 different places. And one of them is the gods or the devas. And anyways, there's 6 of them, and I just want to very quickly sort of go through them. But at the end of the 6, the idea is that those are our different selves. And the idea is that we're all of those at some point, all of us. And maybe Donald Trump is more some of these than I am, or others, or most people, but we're also, all of us share that to a certain extent. And so am I really different than him? I think the answer is maybe yes and no. But let me just go through them. And the other thing is that, and again, this is in Buddhist cosmology in terms of, what happens after people die. There are other realms, but these are the 6 major realms of what, believes this stuff. But the interesting thing, even if you don't believe it, it says, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I want to make this point again, is that these are our different selves that emerge given the situation. Number one is the highest is the diva, or the gods, the heavenly beings, and they're all about wealth and power. They have lots of pleasure. Hot tubs, hot foot sun, sex. Oh, it's great.
Gold,
What's that?
gold, gold.
Gold, lots of gold. But they're not very compassionate. They're not very wise. All of these have clingings. They're sort of selfish in one way or the other. But they're not compassionate. So they have a good life, but they're selfish. The second are the so-called titans, or the semi-gods. They're also living a life of pleasure, but they're very envious. They're jealous. Okay? They're really impatient. They belittle others. They want to be better than others. The third is what they call the realm of the hungry ghosts. This is a figure that has the head and then a really, 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 really long neck and then a really, really giant stomach, because they have this insatiable appetite. And they're the hungry ghosts. They want to eat and consume all the time, but it's so difficult because their neck's so long, it takes so long. More. Anyways, it's just sort of this cruel anatomy. But they're insatiable. They're addictive. They're obsessive, compulsive. It's endless craving. Then another realm, again, these are not the happy realms. It's the hell realm, in which literally everything makes us angry. They're angry all the time. And they're very, very aggressive. They attack. And then there's the animal realm. Again, these are the three lower realms. Narrow-minded, very sheltered, down and out, just not smart. Prejudice, complacent, knuckleheadedness of the first degree. You would just call this person just flat out dumb. That's the animal realm. The human realm is the other. And from a Buddhist point of view, or Buddhist cosmology, this is the only place where one can really become enlightened and reach nirvana. And the other five, you have to live out your karma, which may take a long time or a little time or a really, really long time. But all of those, in order to achieve another, to be able to reach enlightenment, one always has to make the way to the human realm. And so again, in reading some of this, and I read the short versions, a lot of Donald Trump's personality traits, they're just laid out there as plain as could be, and they're not pretty as far as I'm concerned. At the same time, those are things that, of course, I have to identify with at different points in my life as well. So, that's a dance that I'm doing around this, about how to be sort of truthful about what's happening around the issue of suffering. Now, it's about 20 of 9. I'm hoping you can stay away for maybe another 15 minutes, and I want to get to the main points that I wanted to get to in the second main part here. And it has to do with the danger of ideology in politics. And ideology comes from ideas. And what I want to do is just spend just a couple seconds here talking about, again, we're really moving to American history, American politics. We're going to get into, in a few minutes, that we have been living for some time in a very ideological age, where ideas, values are really more important than real human people and the suffering that they're going through. And something simple as freedom. In the name of a concept of freedom, millions and millions and millions of people are suffering at all sorts of levels, and I'll get to that. So what I want to do is just do a real quick sort of survey of history in the 20th century. And again, I know we're shifting gears here, but you're very, very adept and facile and smart group, so I'm not worried. It's fair to say that history goes in cycles. If you look at the 20th century, especially after FDR, remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected 32, 36, 40, 44. This guy's elected 4 times. Imagine that, 4 times. And I will say, we think things are tough now. I think the one global issue that makes everything different, number one, we have nuclear weapons, and number 2 is global warming. I mean, the world is different. That issue, global warming, change is unprecedented, obviously. But think about living in the 1930s. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, soon to be on the run, that's later. But fascism alive, Japanese military, you know, rampaging, raping their way through East Asia, Europe, all after the Depression. The Depression and then World War II. That's a pretty bleak time. Anyways, Roosevelt elected during that whole time, 4 times. He dealt with all of it. I can't imagine what that was like, literally. When you think about early 1940s, the war has begun, the Depression's barely, not really over yet. Man. Anyways. But surely since Roosevelt, no party has been in power for more than 2, that's not true, Reagan, yeah, more than 2 times, right? And so it's you know, I can go through all of them, but we don't need to. But we have basically Roosevelt. We have so we have, you know, we have we have Democrat Truman, we have Eisenhower 2 times, we have Kennedy, we have LBJ, we have Nixon, we have Carter, etc. We got Reagan, etc. Anyways, but it's Republican Democrat, Republican Democrat, Republican Democrat. We are going through cycles, right? And clearly we are in a particular cycle at this point. In terms of the liberal vision. And the liberal vision is basically defined by whether or not the government, meaning the state, what we call the welfare state, is going to provide services to people who are struggling, right? Depression, we have the 1930s, Social Security, unemployment, all that stuff that comes with that. We lived in the liberal time from the 30s until the 80s with Ronald Reagan. 1960s, LBJ, we had Medicaid, Medicare, all the education support. The welfare state got bigger and bigger. And so the ideology of the time was the government needs to compensate where capitalism fails. Capitalism is great at generating wealth and creativity. It's brilliant. At the same time, there are lots of people who fall through the cracks who are not the winners. They're the ones who suffer. And the question is, the government, who's going to take care of them? Well, either nobody or the government, right? And that's basically the liberal vision. After the civil rights, everything else of the 60s, the Vietnam War, the failure of Vietnam, or the so-called first war that we lost, but again, that's not completely true. But anyways, it divided the country in the backlash of the 70s. Ronald Reagan comes in and begins the conservative era. And for my, you know, take on this history is that we're still in it. Obviously, we had Clinton, we had Obama, but they basically were within a much larger conservative framework, and we can talk about that if you're interested. Anyways, and so beginning in the 1980s, and there's this famous memo that's been highlighted in the last few years called the Powell Memo. Lewis Powell became Supreme Court Justice, and he wrote this memo in 1971, and he basically said is that business has got to get its act together and become very, very political, organized. So what happened in the 70s? You had billionaires putting money into think tanks. You know, it was everything from the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise had already been there, Manhattan Student, Hudson's, all these places out, the Hoover Institute had been there for a while. But all of these think tanks, many of them were very, very conservative, you know, multi-millionaires behind them, the Coors, and all those folks. And then, of course, you had the Koch brothers with all of their money. So anyways, you had big money, and then you had the social conservatives. So you had big business and social securities, which is why Reagan was so brilliant. Before that, it was just big business. The social securities were, in general, relatively poor white people, and they were all Democrats until the civil rights of the 1960s, and then they all became Republicans because all the most of the white Democrats in the South were against civil rights, and therefore they've all gone Republican, and that's why they're all Republican now. Anyways, but the point is after that time, we moved into the conservative era, and I would argue that we're still in that era today, even though we've had different blips of sort of liberal initiatives. Now, what I want to get to is this issue of ideology, though. And so what happens is that during this time, Republicans develop a ideology that's basically very pro-business. It's arguing in the name of freedom, right? In the name of freedom. And, you know, Reagan, we all remember, the government is the problem, right? The government is the problem, therefore we must get rid of the government. And the market becomes the new religion. And I would argue, in fact, in the religious sense, and for those of you who follow Bush and follow Colin Powell's son named Michael Powell, Bush made him the head of the federal FCC, what is it, the Federal, you know, Communications Commission, what is it?
Federal Communication Commission.
Thank you, Federal Communications Commission. Michael Powell, sure, lovely guy, says, the free market is my religion. The free market is my religion. And what we had is that this ideology really became dominant. And again, there are really benefits. So let me talk about ideology just for a second. And ideology is a system of beliefs. It's our belief system. It's comprehensive. Every single one of us has a little bit different ideology. Some of us may be liberals, conservative, radical, whatever. And yet it includes everything from birth control to taxes to war in Iraq to, you know, should we have prayer in school, to is meditation a good idea, whatever it may be. All of those fits into our political belief system. It explains reality. It's really helpful because it organizes us. And if there's an ideology, we can take it off the shelf and say, oh, I'm that, this makes sense to me, and then it helps. So number one, it helps make sense of the world, but it also helps us figure out what should we do now, right? Should we write a letter? Should we do nothing? Should I, you know, whatever. It helps us organize our life. The danger of ideology, if it's conservative, liberal, whatever it may be, and we see this in the Soviet Union. The Soviet ideology was the fact that the party is everything, and you are good only to the extent that you serve the party, and the party is everything, right? The problem with that ideology, and any strong ideology, is that it's separate from the reality of people's lives. You live in the area of ideas, and those ideas may be beautiful ideas, but they may not necessarily feed people. They may not house people or clothe people. We could go into Soviet ideology and Leninism and democratic centralism, but that's for the political science class. Anyways, so, and he goes on and on. So the Powell thing is very interesting. I won't read it, but he basically says in 1971 is that Ralph Nader and the civil rights, all those women and all those blacks and all of those people who are challenging the free enterprise system, we've got to fight back, and we've got to put money where our real interests are. They became very, very political. And so what happens, and surely I'm not alone, I think most people agree that we've been since Reagan, we've been in a very, very ideological time. And what's happened during this time is that you've had Reagan, you've had Bush, who were all about ideology. You had to be a true believer. We had the Reagan doctrine. We had the Bush doctrine. Now remember, doctrine comes from the Catholic Church. This is when God himself tells the Pope that this is true, and you believe it because that's what God said in the Catholic Church, which I grew up in, and I love the church, is true, right? It's like religious faith. Don't question it, just believe it. And that's where ideology is very, very dangerous. Trust it, you know, just trust it, believe it. You don't really have to question it. What we see in the 90s with, and again, one of the interesting books, if you really want to understand, what was helping me reframe that, what a book that was very helpful for me, these two guys, Thomas Mann and Norman Orenstein, these are like, they're probably in their 70s now. They've written probably 20 books together. One is a Republican, one is a Democrat. One works at the American Enterprise Institute, which is very conservative. One is at Brookings, which is liberal. So Brookings with the Democrats, the American Enterprise Institute with the Republicans. So these guys are sort of moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats. And they wrote this book in 2012, and it's called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. How the American constitutional system collided with the new politics of extremism. And I would put ideology there. they say, and these are guys who do not, they analyze, they don't critique, like, they're very moderate guys, but in very reluctantly, they came to this conclusion about the Republicans. And they said, the Republican Party, this is 2012, is an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited and social and economic policy regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. Our problem is polarization, but not just any polarization, asymmetrical polarization. The Republicans are more partisan than Democrats. Now, for some of you, you're going, oh yeah, of course, obvious. Others, you go, I don't know about this, I don't like what that's saying. You're blaming the Republicans here. I think what we want to talk about is accountability. But here's some data, political scientists back this up. There's this question of moderate. You know, the moderate are those, I think, are folks who are willing to compromise. They're willing, thanks a million. Thanks. See you later. Have a good night. You too. Willing to compromise, see legitimacy in the opposite, like follow the facts and science and the evidence. You know, they're sort of what we would call sort of mainstream reasonable people. And so these two, I think they're political scientists, they looked at the last 70 years and they talked about ideology based on the voting in Congress, okay? In 1940, only 4% of Democrats were not moderates. They were on the extreme. 4%, 4 out of 100, okay? Republicans only 2 out of 100, 2%. In 1960, they went through the voting. They said only 7% of both Republicans and Democrats in 1960 were not moderates, who were sort of what they would call extreme. That's 1960. 1980, just when Reagan comes in, the Democrats, 10% moderates, 10% is not moderates. So let's say, so 10% is extremes, Republicans 14%. So it went from 7 to 14. In 2000, Democrats, this is interesting, and you say, well, they're Democrats. Well, I don't know what they are, but they go by the voting, and these are good political scientists. My guess is that they just followed the evidence. Is that the Democrats in 2000, they said 10% of Democrats were extreme, 53% of Republicans. In 2014, still 10% of Democrats were extreme. They calculate 88% of the Republicans are now just off the charts. And if you look at this, and I wish, anyways, it basically is for those 40 years, it just like goes about like this, and then in the last 20 years, the Democrats basically stayed, the Democrats and the Republicans literally go up like that. It's like a rocket. And, okay, so that's one piece of it. And again, I'm talking about ideology, and all this is going to come back to the sense of our notion of ourselves, who we are deep down, and why, if we're going to move to a new politics, we've got to ask, who am I? What, you know, look at the ideas that I have. Are they selfish? Are they unselfish? The media. You know, one of the things that's happened during this time is obviously Fox News. And it's easy to criticize it, but I have to say, you know, as an academic, and I will say, as an academic, you got to show me the facts. Otherwise, I just don't believe it. That's, you know, one of the things that's drilled into you as you go on, and you know, the higher level of education. If they ain't there, it doesn't count. And these are convincing to me. Conservatives, people today are the most, they're called consistent conservatives. This is, I think, the Pew Foundation. This is Pew. I have sources, I have references for everything if you need it. Anyways. Among consistent conservatives, meaning the real hardline conservatives, in terms of getting the news at Fox, 47% Fox is their number one. That's where they get it. The mostly conservative, 31%, Fox is where they get it. What's interesting is the consistent liberal, none of them get their news more than 15% from one place. They get it from all different places. The New York Times, NPR, MSNBC are the top three. NPR, yeah, we're the top three, okay? And so the conservatives is like half of them are all at Fox. The liberals are sort of at like 4 or 5 different places, okay? Oh yeah, this is all Pew, this is 2014. I have the source here. All right. There's something called, let me just take ideology a step further here in terms of where we are politically. As some of you are familiar with this group called PolitiFact. PolitiFact is a fact checker, and everything I can tell, as unbiased as I can be, is that they are very, very responsible. Their writing is, they have facts to back up their positions. It comes out of Tampa Bay New Times. It seems to be an independent operation. From my reading of them, they do a very, very thorough job. And so what they are looking at are how much facts the politicians today actually adhere to. In terms of there's like completely true, mostly true, and then there's mostly false, false, and then they call it pants on fire, and they call it ridiculously false. Okay, I mean that's literally something like that. It's
Would that
just
be
stupid.
fake news?
Fake news, but it's not fake news that instead of 10%, it's 40%. It's the idea. When you make something up, like 3 million illegal voters, when there's evidence of maybe 25 or something like that, you know, when you actually look at the numbers. I mean, that's just a preposterous. Again, anyways, I want to get to why a lot of people believe this. And if you can bear with me, we're going to get there. So anyways, this is their read on this. And they went through all, like Hillary and all these folks, and what they have is that in terms of what Trump has to say, 69% of what he says is mostly false or pants on fire false. Rush Limbaugh, 76% of what he says, and Fox News is 60%. CNN is 23%, and Hillary Clinton was 26%. And so this is the interesting thing. You know, Trump at 70%, Hillary, you know, so two-thirds of what he says is untrue, one out of 4 is what he says. And let me just take Trump I mean, this is just one of a million. You know, the climate piece, right? One of his sentences says that as of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens, which is an oxymoron. It's non-binding, which means it can't be draconian, because draconian means it's imposed on it, and nothing is imposed on it. So it's all voluntary, so it's not draconian. And then he goes on to say, China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants, so we can't build the plants, but they can, according to the agreement. Which is, of course, completely untrue. And what it says is that each of the countries should strive, this is a quote, should strive to formulate and communicate long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies. However, it goes on, and all they have to do is announce it publicly, what their goal is, and to report on the progress. That's the only mandatory. And what it says is that the agreement, number one, never uses the word coal, and that the China can do whatever it wants, just like the United States can do whatever it wants, because it's non-binding and voluntary. And this notion that they will build it, but we can't build the plants, is just a fabrication. And then it says it allows China can do whatever they want for the next 13 years, suggesting that, of course, the United States can, when in fact, we can do the same thing. Thanks very much. Anyways, so this is an example. They would say that this is false. Okay, it's not super false, it's just false. Okay, and there are lots of others I don't need to go into. This is one of the things that's interesting, a couple of things that go from this. And this article quotes all these various psychologists, and it's really interesting to understand politics in the last X number of years, I've realized that often the most helpful place to go is to go to what the psychologists have to say, not the journalist, the psychologist. And so what the question was here is, with all of these lies, how can all these folks believe it? Okay, and the thing is I mean, Trump's a very interesting guy, and I've gone through about 4 or 5 books, and you know, he doesn't deny lying. He calls it, in one of his books, you know, he calls it truthful hyperbole, right? Truthful hyperbole. He didn't make it up. His writer, the ghostwriter, made it up, and he said he loved it. So here's the thing that's interesting: is that this is Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert. He says, what happens when a lie reaches the brain? He says the brain processes information in 2 ways. The first millisecond, the brain has to accept it as true, otherwise they can't make any sense of it. And then in the next millisecond, they decide, oh, this is true or this is baloney, okay? But he says that one of the things that's so interesting about Trump is that that he repeats things so many times that Number one is that he sells so many things that are not true, it's hard to keep up. And number 2, he repeats things. He says, as it turns out, he says here, when there's a constant stream, he says, our brain just, that second step, we get tired of it. And he says, but Trump goes even further. Not only does he have so many untruths, he goes a step further. He simply states it over and over. And he goes on, I quote here, as it turns out, sheer repetition of the same lie can eventually mark it as true in our heads. Repetition of any kind, even to refute the statement in question, only serves to solidify it. And for those of you who follow, it's called framing. One really interesting thing, my beloved wife Kim uses a lot in her work, is stuff on the Framing Institute. And the idea is very simple. It's like the first thing you want to do, convince somebody, you get an emotional frame up there. It doesn't have to be true. It's like freedom, or patriotism, or strength, or courage, or love. Once you get the emotional frame up there, that's what sticks in people's head. The facts are really secondary. And if you repeat the frame on an emotional level, the information, the factual stuff won't make any difference. That is why Ronald Reagan was so brilliant. And the other thing that the other research I was reading talks about, the brain functions by making stories. In order to understand the world, the brain makes stories up so that we can make sense of it. And one of the things that the Republicans have done, and Trump was able to do, is that they would tell the story. It doesn't have to be a true story, but it's a story that resonates. You know, Trump talked about welfare queens. You know, the woman that did this and that, it was a false story, but he told it years and years, and yeah, all those poor, those black people, all these white people, all those black people down there, and everything about terrorism or whatever it may be. So here's the point, is that the New York Times, and I remember reading this, the New York Times says, Trump claims without evidence that millions of people voted illegally. So if you believe it or not, what people latch onto is the frame that Trump has repeated and repeated and repeated, that people have voted repeatedly. In some states, I read this about a month ago, the arguments of conservatives of why they need voter ID laws is that now, it's not that there's been evidence of illegal voting in their state. It's the fact that the perception is out there that there is voter illegal, and therefore people believe it, and therefore the law is passed to make people feel good about it. So the fact is, you pass a law based on a lie that becomes repeated, that creates a perception, an idea, an ideology that's part of an ideology that now actually becomes a law that's going to disenfranchise thousands and thousands of people.
Immigration is the same.
Yes, immigration, exactly. So let me just, a couple more things and then I'll stop here. There's just one more point here, another article. Oh, this is great. A Federalist, James Madison, one of the great writers of the Constitution. He writes, Federalist number 10, one of the most famous, he says, and this is about the fact that why is it, so number one is, the point I was making is that repeating a lie, it really actually gets into our brain. This is, this is the big lie that the Nazis used.
Yes.
Propaganda and so forth. If you listen to North Korea, you hear some North Koreans.
He's learning from history.
There we go. So, so there's a question of the repeat something, and in fact it will sink in. And the second is, why do people believe it? James Madison said, we're talking a couple of years ago, as long as the connection between his reason, we're talking like the average voter, and his self-love, man's opinions and his passions, it's his old English, so it says, the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. What he basically says is that if there's a challenge between your reason and your love of self, your self-image, you will always choose your self-image basically over the facts. And so this is called the justification theory, and I'll just very quickly summarize it. It's basically, we love our opinions because we love ourselves. And if those opinions conflict with the facts, we'll choose ourselves over the opinions. The stronger we feel about an opinion, the more we're going to resist any evidence. The psychologist Carol Travis says, the more effort we put into something, basically, in other words, our opinions, the more we're going to resist having our mind changed. And there's this wonderful term that this Buddhist called antithetical bonding, and he takes this a step further. I'm sorry, let me just continue. Sorry to be jumping around here a little bit. But the psychologist continues, is that the stronger you believe it, the more you're going to double down on your beliefs. And what her research is showing her is that when people throw darts at Trump, his followers feel that they're throwing darts at them. So therefore the polls are, any attack on them is attack on Trump is attack on them. Therefore we should not be surprised that they're reluctant to call him out on his lies, because they would be admitting that they themselves have been fooled. We love our opinions because we love ourselves. Right, if the choice is between opinions and the conflict with the facts, we will choose, if our opinions conflict with the facts, we will choose our opinions. And the final thing that I'll add to this is this thing called antithetical bonding, which this Buddhist, Ken Jones, I think, he writes about, Ken Jones, and he basically says that antithetical bonding is when you're part of a group and you have an enemy. And what I see, and again, I remember when Rush Limbaugh came on the air back in the 1980s, I remember listening going, are you kidding? And it was fascinating because it was so outrageous. I mean, what he said was, totally, from my opinion, totally off the wall, and half of it not based on any fact. But he was funny, he was clever, he was incredible. And he attacked liberals with such consistency. And it's very interesting, it seems, that anyone who listens to Fox and to Rush and all the, that media has bonded over this, the enemy, if you will. It's the liberals, and Trump talking about the press as the enemy. And so it's not only the fact that, if you repeat a lie enough, it sinks in. It's not only the fact that even though someone lies, we may not want to admit it. It's the fact that there's real identification and bonding over the enemy. And what I see Trump as today, as the culmination really of about 50 years of this ideological swing from a very moderate, and even Richard Nixon, which at the day, he was conservative guy, hardcore anti-communist. But we're talking about 5–10% of the Republicans then were sort of on the outside, and now there's almost 90% of them are in that level of being outside. And a lot of conservatives say, well, the Democrats are the same. You know what? They're not the same. The Democrats are not that radical. Obama's a moderate. I I mean, think about FDR and what he did. Think about what LBJ did. LBJ, Medicare, Medicaid? Are you kidding me? We're talking about almost universal health care for a certain part of the public. You know, that's socialism of the, you know, and Obama is just taking that a little step further. Anyways, but here's the other part of all of this. Even, you know, looking at all this, and even if one agrees with this sort of analysis of Trump and the lies and so forth, the question is, how do we bring love and kindness to this? And how do we bring unity to it? And, you know, and that's really what I'm going to look at in the next two, especially the fourth session is, and, you know, I have a lot of thinking to do around this. How do I sort of, you know, in my own little part here, you know, be loving and kind at the same time speaking to the reality, you know, 23 million people, or even, you know, if this healthcare thing, we're talking 16 million people next year, 16 million people without healthcare, if the CBO is even close, you know, and they're actually pretty good at this stuff. And how do you sort of deal with that level of human suffering in a way that's not, you know, making, you know, Trump or the other folks supporting this, Republicans and Paul Ryan wrestling the enemy? And that's, and again, and one of the ways is through sitting. And the other thing is through mindfulness. And it's really about learning to live a life of equanimity. And that in many ways for me is the answer. I mean, that's where I come to in terms of my life, in terms of, you know, a daily meditation practice that makes sure that my heart is open. Because a lot of this stuff, it's very, very easy for us to close it off. And that's what a lot of people have done. And the question is how to keep it open and then move forward from there. And that's a big one. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, supposedly, you know, you've heard this, the Chinese character that's supposed to say crisis and opportunity. You know, JFK supposedly had this quote that the Chinese character for crisis is also the opportunity. But I read about 2 months ago that JFK got it completely wrong, and that the Chinese character did not say that. But it's a great idea, crisis and opportunity come together. But what we do see is a mobilization across the country that's just, you know, it's been a long time. So, anyways, let me leave it with big question marks, and you've all been just unbelievably patient. And so I'd love comments, questions, anything that you can possibly generate energy for.
Has anybody in here ever read the Dalai Lama's, I think it was published in 2008. It's called The Ethics for a New Millennium, or for the New Millennium.
Good.
The whole election period, I struggled. It's been similar since. But anyway, that's just me. And I was trying to process, how do I approach this? How do I deal with this? And he's sort of, I think, if you...
I'm familiar with that, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. I'm quite sure you're going to be converging.
Absolutely, that's exactly, yeah. I mean, he speaks to this. Here's the Dalai Lama. The Chinese invaded, you know, he's the head of the country. His country, I mean, he's both spiritual, religious, political, fled for his life. You know the story, most of you, I'm sure. And what they've done to Tibet is, the level of brutality is absolutely...
But I think you hit on something that's very unique tonight, for me.
Yeah.
When you know, your intention is to share broadly Buddhist politics.
Right, yeah.
But you can't really do that by focusing on one individual over there.
Right.
Because Buddhism is in here.
Yeah.
And
right.
between us all.
Right.
So asking us to kind of, instead of vilifying one person or ostracizing them, separating ourselves from them, we're not going to be able to comprehend it. We're not going to be able to feel it, empathize with it. And it seems to me too that sometimes those villains, whoever they are, whichever side you want to perceive them on, if you borrow some terms from the Dalai Lama's book,
Yeah.
it's all about recognizing negative afflictive emotions,
Mhm.
anger,
Yeah.
resentment, hurt, pain. So many terms that over these 20 years of exponential change from the moderate to the extreme
Yeah, yeah.
we've all felt to some degree. But there seems to be this mass of people on one side that's got more of this pent-up pain. And that's why I've really gotten so involved in this book. And I really encourage you all to get it because it's one of the, I haven't read a whole lot of books lately, but it's one of the books that helps me make sense of the stuff happening around us right now.
Ethics for a New Millennium?
Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, that's what it is, by the Dalai Lama. And
Say it again, I don't want to hear the title.
ethics for a new millennium, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
He speaks to all of this stuff. And again, for him to have to be compassionate toward the Chinese, when he talks about negotiating with the Chinese, he honors them, their interests, their needs, he respects them. He's looking for cooperation. He, as you said, he never vilifies them. His stuff is very, very powerful on this. I mean,
And it's neat because it doesn't matter if you're talking about somebody else. He's really asking us all to be mindful of what we're going through, what we're feeling, what we're thinking, what we're, the thoughts, the emotions, and our deeds, our behaviors. And so if we can recognize within ourselves, in our moments as stuff is rising and flowing and ebbing within us, then we can make better sense of ourselves. We can also do that with each other throughout our day, or with when we hear and listen to the political reports of the day. And it's interesting. It's interesting.
so other thoughts, comments, love to hear.
I'm, yeah, I am with something. It's very difficult for me. I work with people that are having difficulty living, whatever, and I'm a therapist. And I've been doing it for a long time, and he is obviously, you've heard this over and over again, he's a narcissist.
Right.
And everything he does makes sense to me.
As a narcissist.
That's it.
Right.
That's what it is.
Yeah, you look at the definition, it's him.
He's,
I mean, the definition.
he's right on. He's
Yeah.
doing everything that he needs to do.
Right.
And it's difficult, but once I do that, there's some empathy there. You can
Yeah.
actually look at the guy and say, oh, the poor little boy.
Yeah.
He needs to be helped or whatever, because he is a narcissist. But the problem is, he's in a powerful position.
I think for me the challenge is, and you're a retired therapist, the challenge for me, and I think what Buddhism provides or offers, is the chance to look and kind of not get caught in vilifying and making evil. But I go back to what you said. If I start from I am Trump,
Right.
I think I think the other piece is to focus on him loses sight of the fact that right now, if you get up on some of the, God forbid, Facebook or even the political dialogue that's going on, the left is vilifying. I mean, the left is just doing the same thing that the right was doing to Obama. And so part of it is looking and finding the middle ground, the middle path, and looking and saying it isn't about the ideas. It's about a new paradigm. And so that becomes the interesting question for me, is how do we talk? I mean, I think for me, Reverend Barber is doing an incredible job in some of this, with the stuff down in North Carolina. I don't know if you follow him.
No.
Oh, he's the whole new thing, what's it called? He's the president of the NAACP down in North Carolina, and he started what was called the Moral Monday movement.
Oh, yeah, oh, I know.
That's
Sure.
it.
I see, okay.
And he really is articulating that what needs to start happening is a moral revolution.
Right, exactly.
And really kind of wiping away, and it goes back to what you said, Tom, on some level, it's offering a new frame.
Right,
You know, instead of, it's about profits,
Right,
it's
right.
about buying,
right.
it's really about ethics. It's about,
Yeah.
you know, and that for me is
That's
what
great.
I
Yeah.
think Buddhism certainly has to offer. I think, you know, kind of coming from Putney Friends meeting, you know, Quakers have
Right.
another paradigm.
That's right.
But
I agree.
they share.
Right. And that's one reason, and I agree with you 100%, is that the moral critique is not about left or right. It is about, it's a moral piece. That's really, it's not conservative Democrat. You go ahead. Yeah. Other thoughts? This is great. Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
So I
Oh, no, go ahead, yeah.
remember something that happened to me when I was at dinner before I came here today. I went to a pizza place. And but to bring it back first to the Buddhist thought of we're all one,
Yeah, right.
and in our whole existence is just God's play, and we're in it. And so we're just part of it. And so to think about, well, how did we then, as a whole, allow Donald Trump to be in a place of power, right?
Yeah.
And so the only way that I can conceive that, besides thinking that, like, in my own mind, we shouldn't have electoral votes and, you know, all these big things that I can barely wrap my head around
Right.
as a small citizen,
Yeah,
is to think locally,
right. Yeah.
to act globally. And so I was eating pizza at a pizza place today. I'm an educator,
Yeah.
and think in public education, and thinking how narcissistic all of my administrators are. People, and I'm a counselor, school counselor, and I am 100% for children and families.
Yeah.
And public school systems working under national and state budgets are kind of narcissistic and don't automatically work for the children. And I was sitting there today thinking, man, this is so difficult to be in the system. And the pizza place, the woman at the pizza place, I was listening to her greet every single person that came in. Hi, how are you today? How was your day? What happened? And the way that she was acting to every single person that came into that place, I thought, I'd rather work here with her than trying to be doing the greater good for kids in the school system, you know, going against the, and that's, I think, the answer, is that we each individually treat every single person that comes into our lives with that moral character.
That's great. That's great. And, you know, the other thing is that a lot of people feel helpless in terms of where things are, and I'm sure that to a certain extent. I mean, one of the things that I'm going to look at in the fourth talk is about how we all fit into the system, like where we plug in. And the thing is that we can't do everything, but all of us can do something. And the question is what that is. And if we do that one thing that's appropriate, some of us should be out there demonstrating on the street and marching. I have a bad leg. I can't march. I shouldn't be marching. My children march, but I shouldn't march. I can do this, right? I mean, and so that woman as the pizza woman, what a beautiful thing she's given to the world. And so, I mean, that's part of the thing, is how do we figure out where we fit in so we actually feel, you know, I'm in a good place. I'm not feeling like I'm, you know, I'm failing, whatever it may be. I love that example. That's a great example. What's your name, please? Your first name?
Chris?
Chris, thank you.
Yeah, I think the term that we're going to be coming to is more empathy as the tool.
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly a big piece of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely, right.
And that's what's needed to develop that compassion and that
See you guys.
forgiveness.
All right. Everything you do. Shauna, did you want to say something before we wrap up?
Yeah.
We should put this.
So, what
springs up for me is an incident. I also work in schools. There was a fire drill. And for the first time, I got really afraid of like what just happened in London. And then I listened to This American Life, and this guy in Jerusalem is like, where bombings, Iraq, Syria, it doesn't matter where, but it's like the world is coming closer. And in some ways, the United States is more safe than most places.
Right, for sure.
But Portland, Oregon,
Right.
the world is getting very creepy
Yeah.
with just people in that ideological spectrum who think they can just do whatever they want.
Right.
And so I think that's where the mindfulness is really important.
Yeah, right. Right. And one can see ideology run wild in, extreme Islamic violence. I mean, that's ideology at the highest degree, religious ideology.
When you were reading all of the Trump pieces,
Yeah.
it paralleled
Yeah.
ISIS. Extremely.
Yeah. Well, you've all been lovely. Thank you so much. I'm happy to hang out for a little bit. And so same time, same place next week, next 2 weeks. So love to have you for works, and thanks for coming.